Hello, everyone. I'm Jason Cohen, the author of An Introduction to the Art and Science of Chinese Tea Ceremony. Today, we're discussing Book 1, Chapter 3, Aesthetic Experience and Aesthetic Context. Here to talk about this chapter is our editorial team, Patrick Penny and Ryan Ahn. Hello, Pat. Hello, Ryan.
Hey, Jason.
Hello. Afternoon.
Good afternoon. My first question, or perhaps before we jump into the question, would one of you like to give an overview of the central thesis behind this chapter?
Yeah, so just a brief background on it. You basically take two different ideologies and juxtapose them. So we have rationalism, which basically states that there are preconceived notions, rules, sets of instructions that can define what is good and what is bad. And then you use a quote from Kant's Critique on Judgment, in which basically we have subjective liking, which is presented so that something doesn't have to be rationalized to be liked. It can be a judgment based on one's own taste. And so we have those two ideologies basically competing. You provide a couple arguments, for and against, but basically towards the end, we start to look at how can we apply either rationalism or subjective liking to tea ceremony. That basically sets up, I would say, the premise for the chapter.
And do you believe in the rationalism of beauty?
I think that, to some degree, we can rationalize very certain specific things. And I think sometimes it helps to have rational discussions on beauty. You can find, for example, in calligraphy, right, certain strokes, right, might be correct. You can tell if a calligrapher did, right, the strokes in this correct order, if the spacing and framework is all correct. But then I don't think that either has to be, I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think you can enjoy something because it sets out to do something and does it correctly within the framework of its art. And I think you can also like something or dislike something just because. So I don't think that it's an either or, it can be an and.
Ryan, are there first principles you can use to define beauty or to determine what is and is not beautiful?
It depends on the framework. So certainly you can use principles to defend a position about whether or not you find something beautiful. Well, on the opposite side of the coin, beauty is in the eyes of the beholder. So beauty as a subjective experience doesn't necessarily need to be rationalized. But I can certainly articulate why I find something beautiful based on knowledge of a particular subject, like why I might find a particular Yixing teapot beautiful, based on knowledge of how difficult it is to get it into that shape, or how difficult it is to make it so small versus very large, because there's shrinkage rates and high likelihood of cracking. It certainly, you can use it to defend a position, or to set it up and frame it to sell it. On the marketing side of things, and economic side of tea and teaware, being able to articulate why something is so special is really important. Framing it in a way that others can appreciate it.
So I think this is something I liked about the chapter, and the title, I think, summarizes it really nicely: aesthetic experience and aesthetic context. So I think rationalism really defines how we contextualize why something is beautiful, because it fits a certain framework that is known, understood, and relatively agreed upon by general population. And then our experience, I really think, really speaks to the subjectivity of beauty. So within that title alone, I think you capture both of these ideologies. And Ryan, I think you really put it well, how we can apply that to tea. So we have our set of knowledge and our rational framework for why we might find a teaware beautiful. But then maybe you had a lovely experience, right? Maybe you had a beautiful chashi with friends on a gorgeous spring day that you remember using that. And so you find it beautiful because of the experiences you've had with it as well. And so just like, as I mentioned before, I don't think either is correct. I think both are correct, and you can apply them both to why you find something beautiful within tea.
Is tea ceremony and tea itself, is the judgment of beauty a judgment of the whole or a judgment of parts?
I'll just take the beginning of this, but I think that once again, both exist. So you can find specific tea ware beautiful. You can find the flavor, right, of a tea beautiful. But then the arrangement of someone's chashi, right? So the arrangement of the chabu and everything else, you can find that in and of itself beautiful. But then the entire experience, right? After you've digested how the brewer set up the chashi the way they did, why, right? If you understand the reasons, if they timed it with a season, a certain flower, or if they very specifically tailored it to you, right, the guest. You can find the chashi beautiful, but then the whole experience as you digest it, the tea, the chashi, the whole ceremony in and of itself beautiful. So I think it can be tea, and tea ceremony can be digested both in parts and as a whole.
I think just to add on to Pat's point too, it depends on whether or not it's representational beauty or phenomenological beauty, where the whole experience matters a lot more in phenomenology, because what's being judged is the experience that's created, or it's greater than the sum of its parts. But representational beauty, where you could describe or literally write a book or take a bunch of pictures of something that in theory would be perfect, or perfect tea and perfect wares, and however you would define that, might be really a terrible experience for someone if you're brewing them yancha and they just don't like yancha.
Talking more specifically about the flavor of tea, the taste of tea, the flavor, aroma, and texture, is the judgment of tea a judgment of a whole or a judgment of parts?
I think in sensory experiences, the whole matters much more than parts. And there's a couple different ways you could view parts. Parts could be brew to brew to brew, where you're extracting a different fraction of tea with each subsequent steep, where certain types of tea or certain brew methods might exhaust a tea faster, and it gets very watery and unpleasant. But it could also be something like time intensity, where you experience a sip of tea, and the way the flavor presents itself to you changes from when it first enters your mouth to long after you've consumed it and it's still sitting with you.
Yeah, I just want to add a touch onto this. Thinking about very specifically, I had a sample 2005 Shaoguan this past weekend, and there was parts of it that I loved. So it had a really intense huigan. There's a lot of lingering sweetness, in the throat, in the cheeks. It was really punchy. I haven't really been drinking factory tea recently. So it kind of reminded me like, oh yeah, factory tea certainly has a certain strength to it, right? And so the parts of it I liked. When I look at the whole experience, I brewed out the whole sample I got. It was a little too small to break into 2 different brews. So it was about 7 grams with some dust. It was an iron cake. Definitely straight up gave me a headache. And so the whole, I didn't really enjoy the experience, but there was parts of it that I enjoyed. So I think, you look at it differently when you're just trying to enjoy a tea experience versus when you're thinking about, let's say, purchasing, right? This was a sample. It was given to me by a vendor. It was nice of them to share it. The intention, I think, with sharing samples is always that maybe you'll like this and buy it. And I definitely think it'd be a cake where I'd love to, if I want a punch me in the face factory tea, yeah, there's parts of this tea I like. But when I think of my experience with it on the whole, I think unless I brewed like 3 grams, it's probably going to give me a headache every time. So I think, you can like parts and dislike the whole. You can like the whole and not really like every part of it. I do think it comes back to our original statement here, where the experience and the context don't have to really align for something to be beautiful. You can find specific parts beautiful.
Pat, not too long ago, you recommended to me a pu'er cake that was flawed, a pu'er cake that had been dried by a fire. and it's a very good tasting cake, but it does taste a little bit or a lot of bit of smoke, very reminiscent of an American barbecue note in that puer. What does it mean to have a preference for a flawed tea? Or can a tea be flawed if we prefer it?
Yeah, I think flaws can exist even if you like something. So I, am to set up some context, right? I enjoy cigars, I enjoy bourbon, I enjoy whiskey, and so for me, smoky notes, like peated kind of flavors, campfire, all that kind of stuff, I love to find in my tea. And puer is a tea, right, where very specifically we can find a lot of smoky notes. We can get a lot of delicious tobacco kind of flavors. And we don't have to always reach for the lapsang souchong if we want that. So you can certainly enjoy a flaw and still recognize that the flaw is there in the tea, but have a preference for it. And I think that speaks to subjective liking.
And is that recognition of the flaws a recognition of the source of the flaws? Is that a judgment of whole or a judgment of parts?
I would say that it is a judgment of parts. I think you can find a flaw within a specific product and still the whole of the experience can still be relatively good, right? Just because the flaw exists doesn't mean that the whole product has to be bad. But just like with my, recommendation to you, it's important that when, we are presenting this to others, we don't try and hide the flaws, right? So if we like the whole, we should still share the parts that we don't enjoy.
I will, for the record, state that you recommended the tea and I bought it with no questions and only then discovered that it was a flawed tea. Although I will also say that I quite enjoy it. Staying on the topic of taste, on flavor, aroma, and texture, how does taste differ from visual arts like sculptures in the perception of beauty? What does it mean when we talk about the beautiful taste of a tea?
Maybe we can start with, is tea beautiful?
Yeah, tea is beautiful. No, I mean, I think it has to do with formative experience. What you find beautiful, what you like, it all has to do with preference acquisition and the drivers of preference that anyone is getting at towards a particular tea. So if you're very unexposed to tea and the flavors that exist within tea, right? When you're presented with a novel flavor, right, you can have a very strong reaction one way or the other. But if there's enough delta where it really surpasses your expectation, maybe that raises the bar for beauty. I remember very distinctly the first time I had a really good Hong Shui oolong. And I will never shake that memory from my brain about how delicious that was and how unexpectedly delicious that was. And it raised the bar for the flavors that I looked for and the flavors that I was even aware could show up in tea. Similar thing for Guifei or concubine oolongs, particularly some of the heavier oxidized ones. I just remember drinking it and thinking, this tastes just like chestnuts. Like, I cannot believe that this tastes just like chestnuts. So as you layer on more and more of those experiences, your preferences will change. The bar for beauty will change, and it's constantly growing and evolving about what we all makes good tea good tea.
Yeah, I think it's not a static target, right? And I think one of the hard parts with it building as we gain more formative experience is that I think sometimes you can end up chasing, right, these experiences of beauty within tea. You're either chasing, after ceramics or antiques that you love, or you're chasing after the experience, right? Getting a tea that gives you either these transcendent, body feels or qi, or finding a tea that has just this flavor that's on another dimension, right, from a very specific, let's say, peak within the Wu mountain ranges, right? And so there's a lot of dragon chasing when it comes to tea. And so it's important that we recognize that as we build these experiences, it becomes more and more important to step back a little bit and find beauty in the everyday tea experiences as well. Because I've definitely found that probably after 5 or 7 years of brewing, you can start to get a little disappointed with your everyday teas. And so you have to kind of cultivate this enjoyment of beauty within the very mundane or more everyday teas as well.
You're supposed to be drinking your best teas every day.
If only I bought that way. I think it takes a long time actually to build up the knowledge, right? That you want to always spend more money on better teas. A lot of the time early on, I spent a lot of time and money buying large volumes of teas that I just kind of liked or enjoyed, but maybe weren't necessarily the highest caliber of quality, because I just wanted more, right? I wanted more and more tea. It's a human condition there. You want more. But, after probably the 5-year mark, 7-year mark, as I had way too much tea and I was moving around the country all the time, I realized it's much more enjoyable to just have, smaller volume, but a very, very enjoyable tea that you're always going to have a great experience with.
Yeah. It's a delicate cycle of explore and exploit too. Trying new samples, finding new things, and then honing in on the things that you really like.
And finding the beauty within there.
But specifically, neither of you answered the first half of the question, which is how does the perception of beauty differ between visual arts, such as sculpture, versus what should we call it? Sensational arts, such as flavor.
Yeah. So flavor is even more complicated because perception can differ. Unless you're colorblind, when you and I look at the same painting, we're seeing the same features. We can use similar language to describe it. And what can differ is our knowledge or context of that piece that results in our preferences. But flavor is a degree more complicated because what you taste might not be what I taste, might not be what someone in China will taste. It might taste more bitter to you, might taste more astringent to me. So we actually don't even have the same baseline of sensory perception, both within a demographic, let's say within Western tea drinkers, or among different countries. That makes it all the more complicated. And people who are very sensitive to bitter might find shengpuer or very bitter teas not beautiful, not delicious at all, because that's totally overwhelming their perception, where they're not noticing the floral honey notes that you or I are in those same teas.
I was just going to mention sculpture, I don't think was intended to be a visual art, right? It's just in the past couple hundred years that sculpture is a visual art. I think they were made originally to be touched, weren't they?
I'm actually unsure of that.
I mean, no one's allowed to touch David anymore, right? But I think probably in the 1500s, it was made to be felt, feel the features. I think it was an interactive art. I think we've lost that over the past couple hundred years.
I think this is mentioned in a different chapter somewhere along the way, but at one point, actually all the white sculptures were painted. They were painted over. So usually when we think of ancient Greece, ancient Rome, we think of all these shining marble white statues, but they actually never looked like that. The statues were carved and then they're colored in and painted, and they were richly featured. I'm unsure if you were supposed to touch them, but
you have enough people touch it, and in a couple hundred years, 1,000 years, it'll be white.
Marble white.
But this is one of our best non sequiturs.
Actually, the David is quite tall. You probably would only be able to touch its feet.
It is quite tall. So this leads me on to another question. Ryan, if everyone is perceiving something different, why do we agree about anything at all? Why is there convergence? Why is there widespread agreement about things that taste good and things that taste bad?
Well, just because perception is different doesn't mean preference doesn't converge. So you can have pockets of people that can like or dislike things for the same or different reasons. And those types of preferences drive markets and determine what gets created.
But there does seem to be, at least in theory, an aesthetic of flavor that has some level of universal agreement, right? Can we not say that certain cuisines are more renowned than others. French food certainly has more Michelin stars than Russian food, which has probably more Michelin stars than Ethiopian food. So why do we have this large-scale agreement? How can we talk about an aesthetic judgment of taste if what we perceive is different?
I think that a lot of consumers are not very good at articulating why they like something, and that the industry is largely swung by, for lack of a better term, tastemakers that are, lack of a better word is, again, armchair experts that have certain context, knowledge, and biases, but are much more articulate about why they like and dislike things. Can act to promote certain things and certain flavors, but to some degree it is arbitrary around why we like minerality in yancha. I can tell you a nice story that tea is grown on a cliff, and it forces the root systems to go deeper, and the better yancha has much more mineral character, but there's no specific reason why that means you should like it more.
Yeah, when it comes to cuisine, I think there's the context, once again, is important. So Ryan, I really like that you brought this to tea, but when we think about like Michelin stars, there's a lot of historical forces. I think when we think about what is regarded the highest, right? French food, Italian food, there's some colonizing or colonial forces in the mix there. So it's a really, there's a real like confluence of forces that come together to shape why maybe a large group of people have decided that cuisine deserves more stars than another. I really like what Ryan was talking about as far as the tastemakers go, but I also think that it comes down to a great footnote that you have at the end of the chapter where it's all about our enculturation, right? So growing up in America, right? I'm born in the 90s. I would see on TV ads or in sitcoms that like French food or Italian food would be represented as kind of like the highest brow hoity-toity, right? And so that's the media that I'm digesting as I'm growing up is suggesting to me that hot cuisine is belongs to another social class, right? It's above what I really can achieve, but it is something that I should aspire to if I like food or if I like the flavor of things. And then as you start to experience things like I probably Jason, this is going to sound funny to you, but I probably didn't have French food until I was 18 or 19, growing up in Northeast Pennsylvania. So, after I had tried it, I started to see, okay, I can kind of see why people find this so interesting or why it's so highly celebrated. But it wasn't until I was, in France that I could really, I think, understand the context and start to have my own experience with it and shape my own thoughts about it. So up until that point, I would probably just go on, all right, this is 2 Michelin stars, it's got to be good, or this is 3 Michelin stars, top of the top, because I really had no experience and I didn't have any formative context on it.
It's interesting you brought up like the enculturation piece and how long that takes and how pervasive that is. Because even to this day in New York, if you're looking at price per dollar about what you spend on good food, by far French food and Italian food and Japanese food are sort of at the top, where that's where you're paying the most money. And then if you're searching for fine Cantonese barbecue, you can get some of the best in the city, which is phenomenal, really well made, like types of roasted pork and chicken and duck for $10. And how it just doesn't have that large institutional backing of people saying that this is the North Star for decades and decades. But you are slowly starting to see that to shift, and you have prominent chefs like David Chang who are constantly complaining and talking about it. And why can't you charge $50 or $60 for an amazing Cantonese barbecue?
Yeah, I think the story is being rewritten for sure. I think we think about American South, right? Like historically, African American foods or Black foods, right? Always were expected to be cheap, right? People expected that they didn't have to pay, $5, $10, $15, $20 for a large plate of food. But that's also here in the Pacific Northwest, right? That story is being rewritten by some some really highly regarded and famous chefs in this area where, now very Southern dishes are being acclaimed as kind of high cuisine, and they're amazing, delicious. But yeah, I think that story is being rewritten, and there's a lot of historical context, right? Historical forces that have shaped the narrative to this point.
I believe we're on to my last question. How does experience over time shape preference acquisition? And what point do your aesthetic principles change due to enculturation or become challenged? What is that process?
Well, it goes back to primacy of perception, and you're building up internal data points, essentially. The more formative experiences you have, the more knowledge and personal experience that you have to draw on to make aesthetic judgments. So if you've had, let's say you've never had coffee before, and I hand you your first coffee, and you say, wow, this is disgusting. It's just very bitter. It's very roasted. I don't like it. And then I take you to a coffee festival, and I have you taste 100 coffees over the course of a week. Right? You're going to have a much better understanding of the universe of flavor that exists in coffee, what flavors you like among that universe, and you'll even maybe learn other labels. What does naturally processed coffee versus washed coffee taste like? Or coffee from Ethiopia versus Guatemala? And you build up both those personal experiences and knowledge, which then you can use to make aesthetic judgments.
When we think about tea and people really getting into Chinese tea or high levels of tea, everyone comes in with some level of background. So everyone's probably had a Lipton tea bag, maybe a green tea at a Chinese restaurant. And so there's some background context. And then very specifically thinking about myself, when I was exposed to tea with you, Jason, right? I think the first thing I had with you might have been like a Ten Chong Hui Long Zai or, some other probably like Yunanese green tea. And I remember thinking to myself, like, I didn't think green tea could taste like hot dog water. But in a good way. And it kind of from there just, opened my eyes up. And I, over time, really the first year of practicing Gongfu Cha was just trying to drink as many teas as possible. And what that does is it just keeps showing you this world, this expansive world that exists just beyond the horizon of what you can see. And so there's kind of going back to chasing, right? There's always more you can learn. And for anyone passionate about tea, you want to keep having those experiences. And over time, as you started to consume and digest these experiences, literally teas, you of course start to apply your own preferences to them. And maybe in the beginning you were doing that as well. But I think there's a lot of teas that will come around and change your perception. So your perception is constantly being challenged by not only the tea itself, but probably other individuals as well and their preferences. And so a lot of, I think, our preferences are shaped not only by, the teas we've experienced, but by the people who we drink them with. And so, for those who are maybe online drinking tea through, Instagram and just kind of chatting with people online, the way that they acquire preferences is probably very different from us, where we were all together in a room with, at times 5 people and at other times 60 people, all brewing tea together, talking tea, drinking, and shaping our preferences with each other. So, it really comes down to, I think, the experiences you have with tea and with other people.
Is that enculturation or is that something else?
I think to some degree it's enculturation. I think there's other factors that form enculturation as well. So everything happening around you, not just your tea practice, but maybe the foods you like, or, the places you go out to drink, et cetera, the media around you, right? All that's going to be part of enculturation. But certainly for your tea practice, the people who you drink with are also, I think, a large force within your enculturation.
I've made the argument before that the reason that the physical locations, physical gatherings of tea practitioners is so important is the formation of an ideoculture, which can become a microculture. So it does sound like what you're describing is that enculturation, is the formation of the ideoculture, the who you're drinking with.
Right. We all had preferences. Some of us were able to, I think, articulate them much stronger than others. And As Ryan mentioned before, those who could strongly articulate their preferences found others who, would agree with them, and then those others, their preferences start to sound a little bit more like those who had articulated them better before. And we see biases, right, form within this microculture for, certain flavor profiles, certain teas. And, certainly we see that is enculturation. It's definitely shaped the way that I drink tea. As I think it's probably shaped, many of us who were together in the Institute in the formative, half decade or so.
And with that enculturation too, you have cohesion effects, where my determination of quality is as much my preference as it is a guess about how other people in the group would determine whether or not it's good or bad, which circles to go full circle. Instead of beauty being in the eye of the beholder, it becomes an incredibly rational pursuit, with lots of justification and where you attribute things based on some set of principles.
So you would argue that liking things that other people like is rational?
Absolutely not.
But you are a product of your enculturation. And so you have striven to like things that other people like.
That's true as well.
But you would not call it rational.
It's a contradiction.
That's what makes us interesting. People are full of them.
I think I like that segment. To end this editorial conversations, we'll go back to our reoccurring favorite segment, hot takes. And considering that we've been discussing preferences, acquisition of preferences, and whether or not preferences are rational or not, we're going to do an up-down, rational or irrational. So I'm going to pose a piece of art, a type of tea, and I'm going to ask whether your preference, you'll have to say, I like it or dislike it, and rational or irrational. So we'll start off very easy. Ryan, the David.
I like it, and it's rational.
I'm sure.
I like it. What?
I'm sure.
Dislike, irrational. I don't really care for sculptures.
Ooh, unexpected. Pat?
What a twist.
Mona Lisa.
Like it, irrational. I really enjoyed my experience looking over like 100 people trying to see it at the Louvre.
Ryan?
I dislike it, and it's irrational.
All right, Pat? Ongi teapot.
Oh, like rational. Great effect on tea, beautiful shapes, beautiful forms. And then my experience with a potter, everything about it, love it.
Ryan?
Rational, dislike. I don't think it's very suitable for most tea. For some Korean tea, it is very suitable, but for everything else, I think it's does worse things to the tea than yixing or porcelain.
I don't disagree.
Okay. Obi belt chabus.
Ooh. Like it. This is a bit of both. I have, I'd say irrational. I've had some beautiful experiences with chashi using OBT belts. But then thinking about rational, a lot of chabus are just made from kimono material anyway. So why not? Why not just use an old OBT belt? It's a beautiful form of mitate, which I think we talk about in a later chapter.
I like it as well. They're beautiful. They're the perfect size for a chabu, and it's very clever and resourceful repurposing.
And then so if you're found without a belt, then boom, there you go. You've got one.
White chabus. Pat.
Ooh. Dislike, rational. There's so many teas you don't want to brew with them. Don't care how good your skill is. You're probably going to get a drop of some show puer on that. Just not very useful.
Dislike, fully rational. No one is that good at brewing.
The basement of Rittenauer building.
Love, irrational, because it's kind of gross, but Man, just had so many good times there. A lot of good brewing vibes in that building.
Love it as well. Totally irrational. For those who don't know what that is, that's where the Tea Institute, Penn State, that's where the tea house was. We all have a lot of good memories down there.
Except for some of the massive silverfish or centipedes that we'd see crawl throughout. So yeah, that's why that love is irrational.
Who knew bugs could get that big?
Jason, rational or irrational? Giant spiders in Taiwanese hot springs.
Love, irrational. I like where I find them. They show up in the most unexpected places.
That's a story we really can't share on the podcast, so we'll maybe leave it at that.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us in this edition of Tea Technique Editorial Conversations. Please join us again for a discussion of the next chapter, What to Make of Dragons.